there will be a little bit of Keir Starmer who goes, okay, do you know what, mate? You're on the front page of the Sunday Times here. This is literally my second day as Prime Minister. Maybe you could have piped down a little bit.
So Tony Blair has warned Sir Keir Starmer that prejudice against migrants will only increase without effective rules put in place. He's writing in today's Sunday Times. He says the new government must also focus on law and order and avoid becoming vulnerable to charges of wokeism. Latika, do you think this is this helpful advice, or is this just actually potentially a danger for Keir Starmer that he just lives in the shadow of a former very successful Labour leader?
I think what Tony Blair has to say, particularly on immigration, is extremely valid and worthwhile. And one of the things I really enjoy about Tony Blair is that he's a constant forward thinker. A lot of ex-PMs are very, I think, inclined to say, well, back in my day, this is how we did it. This is how we secured the centre. This is how we secured a majority. And if you only just do what I did, you can be as great as I was. One of the things Tony Blair does is not that. And he very clearly adapts his thinking to the modern challenges that are confronting us. And I think he's doing that very clearly on his comments about immigration. And he's right. I mean, in Australia, we had this debate about immigration and borders 2 decades ago. And a lot of the international community likes to see Australia as racist, as too harsh. And look, our border measures were extremely tough. They were extremely cruel and they were extremely harsh. But one thing I will say is that nipping immigration in the bud meant that we didn't have this far-right surge. And of course, that's helped by our voting system. Back, though, I think to your question, Chloe, I do feel that Tony Blair is just a little too hasty out of the blocks. I mean, this is Keir Starmer's moment. Keir Starmer achieved a huge majority. He is the guy in charge. He's the guy in Downing Street. Let's hear from him. And maybe if Tony Blair has this advice, he should maybe be doing it privately, although I certainly agree with the content of the advice.
I see you nodding, Peter.
Yes, I think this is Keir Starmer's moment. He hasn't even been Prime Minister for 48 hours, and already his predecessor, Tony Blair, is sticking his oar in, and it is his moment. He is the sort of political Martine McCutcheon of the situation, and I think where I do feel slightly sorry for him, but at the same time, everything that Tony Blair says is correct. I think they do need to be very aware of immigration as an issue. I actually interviewed Keir Starmer about 2 weeks ago, and he said that smashing the gangs was the deterrent. And I said, yes, but what's the deterrent? He said, no, that's the deterrent. And I'm not sure that's going to work in terms of stopping small boats crossing the channel. But certainly with the wokeism allegations, certainly Tony Blair, who is a forward thinker, I agree with single thing that Latika has said. There are 98 seats where Reform came second to Labour. There are going to be lots of MPs, including actually the new Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, who was run not that close, but close enough by Reform. And people like her will be saying, actually, hold on, we need to be radical, but we also need to be very aware of who's breathing down our necks. And there is, I think, a fairly lazy assumption that all Reform voters are former Conservative voters. The majority are, yes, but there are a lot of Labour Leave people, for example, a lot of people disillusioned with other parties, disillusioned with all sorts of parties who go to Reform, because it's not just what they espouse, it's also to do with being a sort of anti-politics vote as well. For Tony Blair, yes, he has interesting things to say, but also and he continues to be a very influential person on the world stage. But I don't know, I think there will be a little bit of Keir Starmer who goes, okay, do you know what, mate? You're on the front page of the Sunday Times here. This is literally my second day as Prime Minister. Maybe you could have piped down a little bit, or maybe just told me privately. And I'm sure he's told him probably all these things privately anyway. But sometimes there is a sense that Tony Blair needs to be relevant and needs to be current. And he is current and he is relevant, and even more so now that in the state of Keir Starmer being Prime Minister.
Is there any way, though, that Keir Starmer didn't know this was coming? Surely there's a conversation between Blair and Starmer saying, look, I'm going to say this. Or maybe there's a conversation between Starmer and Blair where he says, actually, I could do with you saying this. It might help me out, set me off on the right track.
Certainly that will be part of the conversation, but I don't think that there will have been a conversation. And there are a lot of Blair people, as we know, both in front-facing roles. Obviously Jackie Smith is now the previous Home Secretary, is now an Education Minister. We also have people who worked, Tony Blair's former Press Secretary Matthew Doyle is now the Director of Communications, behind the scenes, very, very influential, top aide there, important person. So I'm sure there will have been a conversation, but it'll have been a slightly one-way conversation. It will be Tony Blair saying, by the way, I'm doing this.
Right.
Probably the Starmer number 10 saying, could we possibly see the article a few hours beforehand? I can understand that I'm sure would have been given as a courtesy. But I don't imagine Keir Starmer would have gone, actually, Tony, could you not do this? And Tony would go, oh, yes, of course not. I don't imagine that was a conversation that happened.
But Latika, presumably, by bringing in Jackie Smith, bringing in Douglas Alexander, getting Alan Milburn to advise on the NHS, Keir Starmer's kind of leaning into this Blairite experience anyway, isn't he?
Yes, and I think it's really critical for these messages to come out of the mouths of the current government, for this government to have legitimacy in tackling the issues that are on its front in terms of reform voters potentially eating away at its own base. The government of the day needs to be saying this, not Tony Blair. And I think it does actually start to diminish the authority of a new government if you have the old leading light saying, hey, here's all these ideas I've thought of, bet you haven't thought of. And that automatically sets up a dynamic where now the cabinet is, well, that's just what Tony Blair said. Do you agree with what Tony Blair said? Do you disagree with what Tony Blair said? I just think right now that dynamic is not entirely helpful for the cabinet as it needs to establish its authority, its voice with the community.
Let's consider then the kind of the start more broadly for Sir Keir Starmer, who, as we say, it's pretty fresh as Prime Minister. Today he's heading off to visit the First Ministers of Scotland, of Wales and of Northern Ireland. Angela Rayner apparently is cracking on with this overhaul of the planning system. He held his first cabinet meeting yesterday. He held a news conference after that. The NHS and prisons have both featured quite highly on the hit list. Wes Streeting saying that the policy of the Department of Health is that the NHS is broken. He's going to meet the junior doctors next week. Is it an energetic start, Peter? What word would you use?
It's a busy start and an energetic start. And yes, I thought that Keir Starmer seemed very relaxed at that press conference yesterday. More relaxed, actually, than he seemed in a lot of the campaign, although I'm sure there's both celebration and relief that he's finally, after 4.5 years, got to the position that he's in. But yeah, you do need momentum at the start of an administration. He's master of all these surveys and hasn't had a problem so far, but that won't last long. The honeymoon will not last long, and the problems will stack up. Maybe not from his own party, who I'm sure are delighted with this 174 majority, but at the same time, there will be all sorts of issues. The prisons issue, massive issue, and he's already realistically said, we're not going to sort this out immediately. Very radical appointment in James Timpson as prisons minister, someone who doesn't really believe that prisons are the way forward. And am I the only person who's noticed that guy made a career of cutting keys? Just saying. But anyway, but no, it's very, very interesting. And yes, there is a lot. And I think the NHS junior doctors discussions that Wes Streeting is going to have new momentum into that. And the tour of the awesome foursome, the four nations of the United Kingdom, is a really good idea for Keir Starmer to cement the fact that he is a Prime Minister of all four nations. And actually, as we know, of course, Labour won not just in England, but in Scotland and Wales as well. Northern Ireland, a little bit trickier. Obviously, Labour candidates don't stand there. In fact, they're not allowed to stand there. But he's already had what have been described as fruitful discussions on the phone anyway with the First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, and Deputy First Minister, Emma Little-Pengelly. So it'll be interesting to see him out and about, and also the public reception to the new Prime Minister.
Yeah. Latika, when it comes to issues like on prisons, for example, there's a suggestion that the fixing the prison system, building more prisons, will revolve around these planning reforms that are apparently seemingly on the way. Is there a sort of concern, as Peter's getting at, that the prisons minister that's appointed has quite a radical approach on prisons? What is the strategy? What is the approach here? And have Labour been honest in the campaign about what their approach to prisons will be now they're in government?
No, I think one of the benefits of being so small target during his whole time in opposition, really, and saying so little to the public about what they might actually do is that they do have now, I think, some more room to manoeuvre, not, I think, in the tax space, but certainly on reforms and regulations to this capacity. I think the thing I really enjoyed about Starmer and his first press conference yesterday, actually two things: dignity. I felt like for the first time we're watching a Prime Minister understanding that the country really wants to see the office held with dignity and enacted and executed with dignity. And I'm really quite impressed with the transformation of Starmer. From the minute he ceased being opposition leader to the minute he became PM-elect, he was a completely different man, and I think the community will quite like that. On prisons, I think what I also liked about that press conference is not Starmerism as such, but realism. I think it has been too long that the community has heard a leader say, look, our challenges are real, they're big and they're tough, and they're going to take some time. Now, Starmer, I think, is very alive that he doesn't have a lot of time up his sleeve to get cracking and delivering on some of these things. But I think that the start he has made and the communications that he's put out and laid the ground with the public, I think it's an A+ start.
Peter, on that, perhaps understandably, but it can be said that the things that are being talked about, the statements that are being made, the trips that are being taken around the UK, these are relatively straightforward things.
Yes.
And following up on them
Yes.
is the issue. Wes Streeting phoning the British Medical Association and saying, now is the time, let's get in the room and chat, and them saying yes, fine.
Yes.
Following through
Yes.
on the negotiation and
Yes.
reaching a conclusion is the key part. So we're already getting the idea, sure, make the statements fine, but then we have to see the delivery. That's got to be the core theme here.
There is a good that makes perfect sense, Callum, and people can go, oh yes, it's all been marvellous, and they have made a good start. They've made an energetic start, no doubt about that. But also, as you say, it's not the first day, it's the first 100 days, it's the first 1,000 days that are going to be very tricky, and they are going to hit many roadblocks. It's great to have a radical prisons minister. It's great to have a number of people with expertise from previously, although I would question Jackie Smith, who I think was one of the worst Home Secretaries we've ever had. But we do have a lot of energetic people, a lot of talented people. Wes Streeting, despite the fact I disagree with him on many things, I thought his tweet before the London mayoral election was disgraceful. He is someone who understands the health service and is saying the unsayable, and is in a position as a Labour Secretary of State for Health who can say things like the NHS is broken. No Conservative could ever get away with saying such a thing. And at least they're sort of diagnosing the problems, and I think a lot of people will take heart from that, and that they are being realistic, as Latika correctly says. The problem will be the roadblocks ahead and the problems ahead, and explaining that away, and it will be very tempting to fall back on the narrative, especially economically, of, well, we inherited such a mess from the Conservatives, which is fine for a while. I think you can get away with it for about a year, but once you get further on, and also when you have a budget coming up in October, November time, we'll get the date of that at some stage, Rachel Reeves, if she sort of comes out and says, well, I know we said we weren't going to put taxes up, but actually we are, well, then there's a lot that can be opposed about what the government is saying, because their manifesto pledges will have been broken. So, look, it may all be marvellous, but I imagine it will be very, very difficult, and the scale of the problem will very quickly becoming clear to these Secretaries of State who have shadowed these departments for a long time. But until you're in government, until you have the very, very bare, stark facts in front of you, and the civil service telling you the things that aren't public and the things that they haven't been telling you previously, well, that's the time where you go, hold on a second, there's actually a lot more to do here than we thought there was.
Peter,
And I think
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the most pressing challenge of all of those things will actually be immigration, because Starmer, in kiboshing Rwanda scheme from day one, that's now on him.
Yeah.
Solutions are now on Labor from day one. So he doesn't get the, as Peter rightly says, he doesn't get the 1 year kind of, oh, look at the mess we inherited. Boats and immigration are going to be on Labor to deliver very, very rapidly. I'm personally not sure that they can. And I think that is the biggest danger zone, given the growth of reform vote that we saw last week.
Completely agree.
And Latika, it's interesting as well, and we discussed this yesterday, Callum, that, Labour have been very clear that they want to smash the gangs. Labour have been less clear on what they're going to do with people if they do get here by small boat. And we all know, if we look back over previous summers, could be different this year if the weather carries on like this, but generally the water is calmer, more people tend to cross in the summer. So this could be a problem that could be knocking on Keir Starmer's door pretty quick.
I'm also
struck. And a big visual thing
Absolutely.
as well. People will see it and say, what are you doing to stop this?
There's an interesting dynamic here, isn't there? Latika, on the boats, stopping the boats particularly, where Rishi Sunak set that pledge as his government was winding down, effectively. Whereas Keir Starmer has abolished that as a policy, the Rwanda policy. He's still driven to stop the boats crossing the channel, but he's making the promise as his government ramps up. Actually, where Rishi Sunak had, 18 months at most to deliver, actually Keir Starmer has 5 years. He could take a hit in the polls if it doesn't deliver in the first 18 months, because he's still got 3 years to turn it round.
He does, but I think the reform issue is a huge challenge here, because you have not just Nigel Farage, you have 5 of them in Parliament. And this is an attack not just on Conservatives. This is such fertile ground for reform, because they can say, look, Tories couldn't stop it. Labor has less political will to stop this problem. We all know that deep down, and they're still not stopping the boats. only we will stop the boats, and we'll do so by withdrawing from the European Human Rights Court. And so I think this is a very, very diabolical dynamic ahead for Labor. And I mean, I think everybody would hope that their solutions do work, but I would also add that I think if it was so easy to stop the small boat crossings just by smashing gangs, the Tories would have done that.